Military spending is on the rise globally. This year it passed $2 trillion for the first time ever. And it's not just about America or the conflict in Ukraine. Increased spending on weapons is happening across the world in countries like China, Iran, and Nigeria. This has led to criticism that governments are taking money that could be used to deal with climate change and using it to wage war instead. And the richest nations are the ones that are selling all the weapons. So, is the global arms trade making the climate crisis worse? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. The evidence suggesting military spending directly impacts climate change is not hard to find. There are obvious examples like the UK and Norway redirecting money earmarked to help deal with the climate crisis to help Ukraine fight Russia instead. Or there are the less obvious cases, like the fact that new models of US warplanes use even more fuel than the old ones that they're replacing. Then there's the simplest point of all. Money spent on producing weapons is not being spent on safeguarding the environment. Research and advocacy group, the Transnational Institute, estimates that 1 year's military spending by the top 10 military spenders would pay for promised international climate finance for some 15 years. But perhaps the arms industry is too easy a scapegoat for the climate debate. Joining me from Abergavenny in Wales, we have Nick Buxton. He's a researcher at Transnational Institute. Meanwhile, in Stockholm, we have Pieter Wezeman, who is a senior researcher with the SIPRI Arms Transfers Programme. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. I suppose I should open this discussion up by talking to you, Nick. At the moment, we have arms sales rising globally around the world. They're rising at a reasonably fast clip compared to what they've been over the last 20 years. What's going on in your opinion? Is this down to the war in Ukraine and threats from Russia, or is this just a general secular trend?
Well, we can see that since the end of the Cold War that arms spending has more or less doubled. So there's been a fairly steady increase in arms sales. But certainly what we're seeing this year is it's been very much fueled by the Ukraine war. There has been a big increase. So, for example, Germany announced that it was going to increase its military spending by 100 billion in the coming years. That's a huge increase. And we've seen similar increases right across Europe. The thing is that it's kind of out of proportion with just responding to the demand for arms to support Ukraine against Russia. It's really, in a sense, legitimizing a sudden increase, with many of the countries now saying that they're going to try and spend at least 2% of their GDP on arms sales. So we're just seeing a very accelerated arms race right at this moment. And one of the concerns that we've had at the Transnational Institute is what is this impact on a bigger crisis, which is the climate crisis, which one could say is the biggest security threat that not just one nation like Ukraine will face, but we will all face. And if that money is being diverted away from climate finance, if indeed military spending is increasing emissions, then this is a concern for many of us.
But that increase in military spending that you're talking about, going from, in the case of countries like Portugal, 1.4%, 1.5% of GDP, up to 2%, yes, that is happening in the shorter term, but that's been a NATO requirement for the best part of a decade now, and NATO's been banging its drum saying, please, will you spend more on defence? Please, will you spend more on defence? If I took our figures back a little bit further and went to, say, 1970, well, back in the 1970s, the UK, Germany, France, we spent 4% of GDP on arms. So going back up to 2% looks like a lot relative to the end of the Cold War and where we are now, but it's a lot less than was being spent on arms, say, in the 70s and 60s.
Well, I think we have to look firstly at what that level of 2% means. I mean, it's a fairly arbitrary figure. It's been selected. And the question is, does it really address the security threats we face? 2% is pretty arbitrary. And if you look at what, for example, NATO spends compared to Russia, which is now, designated the main security threat to European nations, NATO spends about 17 times as much on the military as Russia does. The US now spends just by itself as much as the 9 other biggest countries. So there's a huge disparity in spending already. So this idea that we need to increase to 2% is quite arbitrary. And then we have to think about what is, as I said, what are the real security threats we face. And the scientists at the moment, for example, climate scientists say we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 45% by the end of this decade. Otherwise, we will get to real tipping points where the climate crisis could escalate. So we are really prioritizing a huge, disproportionate amount of military spending and failing to tackle what will be a crisis that will affect the most people.
Nick, let me bring in Pieter here, if I may. Pieter, what's your feeling with regards to the rising military spending that's going on? Is this coming at the expense of the environment, or is it going on because of other trends?
I think it's very important to stress that, yes, the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to a very strong change in threat perception in Europe. That, of course, has led to an increase in military spending, a very significant increase, up to 50% or more in most European states, if not in all of them. But, of course, it's not just about Europe there. We should remember that this comes on top of the threat perceptions that we see elsewhere in the world too, whether that is the ongoing rivalry between China and the US and a number of states in East Asia kind of joining into that, an increase in spending in, let's say, South Korea, Japan, Australia there too, and of course also a steady long-term increase in Chinese military spending too. But we see it also in the Middle East, where a country like Saudi Arabia has over the years, over the decades, increased its military spending, even though it has been a bit lower in recent years, probably because of the low prices of oil. But still, military spending that has made it possible for Saudi Arabia to engage in a long-term war in Yemen. And then, of course, we also see that in, for example, Turkey, where we also see an increase in military spending, and of course also an increase in the attempts to build up an own arms industry in attempts to become less dependent on other states. And then, of course, that together, even though the levels of spending are by far not as high in terms of a percentage of GNP as they were during the height of the Cold War, still there is a significant diversion of both money, resources in those terms, but also in terms of the kind of skills, the kind of people that get engaged in the development and production and maintenance of arms. That is another thing which you have to take into account. This is a highly skilled sector, and therefore whatever, let's say, brains are being used there cannot be used elsewhere, for example, in relation to developing more kind of environmentally friendly, let's say, energy production methods. So I think there is absolutely reason for concern also when we compare these two sectors with each other.
Well, let's have a look at some of the comments that have been made about this situation. Antonio Guterres, who is the UN Secretary General, has said, and I quote him, "Fossil fuel expansion is hijacking humanity. Any hope of meeting the 1.5 degree target requires a step change in emissions reductions." Obviously, the United Nations is trying to put a lot of pressure on different countries out there to meet their environmental concerns. At the same time, countries have had an enormous number of expenses that they've had to shell out on. There's been the COVID situation. They're raising their military budgets. They've got increasing demands at home in many of these countries for more social services going on. What do you do if you're a country and you have all of these requests for money at your disposal? Do you really plow it into the environment, or do you go, I don't know, Nick, the environment can wait another day. We'll deal with the environment next year. What do you think?
Well, what we have to consider is also, of course, what we don't spend now could lead to much bigger costs in the future. And this is what people such as the World Bank economist Nicholas Stern was saying, is that basically if we don't, the money we invest now avoids far bigger economic costs, and that's not to put aside this huge social and human costs by not investing now. So between 2013 and now, we've spent 9.5 for the richest countries have spent 9.45 trillion on the military. compared to when we looked at this, about 234 billion for climate finance. That's a 30-fold difference between the two. And it's quite clear that we need to redivert some of that money. It can be small percentages, but we're going in a completely the opposite direction. And that's not to say that military spending can resolve all of these issues or provide all of the finance for climate. But it definitely needs to be part of the picture. There are many other proposals out there from the IMF has these things called special drawing rights, which could be released, that could be paid, could be used. And we saw in the whole financial crisis that there was a huge amount of quantitative easing of financing that we're providing. There's also, of course, many proposals around taxing of other industries, particularly the fossil fuel industries and so on. So there's not one answer to this one of the issue of financing, but we really believe that military spending has to be part of it. When you have a 30-fold difference, and when we're spending the richest countries are spending that much level of money on the military and failing to put the money towards what everyone agrees is the biggest crisis we face, then we're going in the wrong direction.
Well, I think it comes from one of your own reports, the statistic that I've got here, that NATO members currently spend 17 times as much together on their military as Russia does. That's one of the points of your recent report, is that NATO is pointing to Russia and saying, well, see, look, Russia's invaded Ukraine, we need more military spending. And you're saying, well, you already outspend Russia 17-1.
Yeah, and that's the question: is when are we? The thing about security is you can always say that we're never secure enough. So there's always a demand to say that we need to increase. And of course, when a country is being invaded and attacked, and we see the devastation on our screens, there's understandably and quite rightfully a lot of sympathy and a lot of support now for Ukraine. But our feeling is that this is also legitimizing the whole increase in military spending as a whole, and a prioritizing of the arms industry in a way that is completely out of proportion to the actual war in Ukraine. There are even industries now I just saw the other day in the German arms lobby, one of the main saying, given our role in the Ukraine crisis, we should be considered a sustainable green investment now, sustainable investment. So it's becoming a kind of a way of legitimizing an industry which is growing and has a role, as Pieter will be able to talk much more eloquently than myself about, which is having a role in also fueling arms races throughout the world. When we did a bit of a research about the richest countries, we found that they were providing arms to 40 of the most climate vulnerable nations. So these are the countries who are at the forefront of the crisis, who face most of its impacts, and yet are not receiving the climate finance they need, but are receiving arms sales. And this, of course, fuels further conflict. Many of those countries are authoritarian regimes. Many have very low levels of human development. Many are not democracies or engaged in war. And rather than providing the finance they need, we're providing weapons, which, of course, fuels a situation of instability, which, if you bring the climate crisis and extreme weather events on top of it, it is not really building a just and more peaceful world that we need.
Well, Pieter, if I can cross to you now, what about greenwashing, which was brought up there a little bit by Nick? Can the arms industry really go green? I hesitate to say this, but a nuclear-powered submarine is more environmentally friendly than a diesel-powered submarine, at least until you launch the missiles, at any rate. Can the arms industry ever reasonably go in an environmentally friendly direction?
I think that's a kind of an important question, as it is being put forward as one of the strategies of the arms industry to develop arms that do fulfill more of these kind of green standards, having lower emissions, etc. But I'm not really sure if that's a very useful debate. I think the real debate should still be about what it is that you want to achieve with the arms that you acquire, and that to find ways to buy only that what's absolutely necessary and not much more. And that is where the real questions lie right now. For example, if we look at Europe and if we look at the threat perception towards Russia, of course it exists. And of course there is a clear, let's say, understanding that the assessment that has been made at the end of 2021 was basically wrong. The intent of Russia was to attack, and that was underestimated. But at the same time, the capabilities of Russia were overestimated. Russia couldn't do what it actually wanted to do. And I think many analysts in Europe and the rest of the world too are surprised about the lack of success of the Russian military machine. And that then should lead to the question of, yeah, but what is it actually that Europe or other parts of the world too would have to defend themselves against? Is it really a superior military machine? Or, as has already been indicated, is it so that in effect Russia has spent a lot less on arms and the military than NATO already has in the past, but also has done that in a very inefficient and most likely corrupt way? So the real question is now, how do you determine what you actually need? And once you have done that, then you can also start to think about whether or not the weapons you buy can be improved when it comes to being more sustainable and all that. But I really wonder if it's not better to just spend that time and that intellectual and kind of technological capacity into trying to develop much more, let's say, efficient cars or energy producing systems. I think there's a lot more, let's say, profit to be made there in terms of environmental impact.
Well, there are easier gains certainly to be made for the environmental cause overall. Does the arms industry, though, look at where, for example, the rest of the automotive industry is going and then say, well, hang on a second, we need to move across to electric vehicles, as a for instance? Do the arms manufacturers, does Smith & Wesson look at the armaments industry and say, well, actually, if we move across to electromagnetic weapons or rail guns or something like that, that is more in keeping with the zeitgeist generally?
I'm sure they do to some extent, but I think their technological assessments and what they are required to do is so much more driven by military performance and not by environmental performance. And I think something which was pointed out in the report by Nick is that the latest combat aircraft, the most standard combat aircraft currently to be introduced or being introduced in NATO is the F-35, which consumes more fuel than its predecessor, the F-16. Now, you maybe need a few less of them, true, but overall, it doesn't seem to have really been implemented in that case. And important to mention there is that whatever you develop right now in military means a new major military arms, it will take a very long time before you really introduce them. Weapons have a very long life, and countries cannot afford to replace them just on the basis of environmental kind of demands.
So, Nick, I saw you nodding through that, so I'm assuming you agree with all of those points. Perhaps environmentalism isn't at the top of the minds of these companies as they're going through their design process.
Well, you do have it now in some of the rhetoric, and I think everyone knows that. So you'll increasingly see the kind of net zero promises. NATO itself has committed itself to a net zero. The US has promised to reduce emissions,
is that useful in your opinion? I mean,
no,
is it a pointless thing?
Our view is when we've looked at these plans, they've been very vague, they've been very ill-defined, and frankly very unconvincing. I think one of the issues, and Pieter alluded to it, is that a lot of the military operations are very highly dependent on fossil fuels. A tank, a jet, a ship, they consume huge amounts of fuel. The F-35, which Pieter was referring to, 5,600 liters an hour. So these are very, very kind of, and it's not very easy to replace those fuels. Either the fuels don't exist or they have huge social and environmental consequences, like huge amounts of land use to produce the kind of from crop fuels that you would otherwise get from under the ground. So our view is really at the moment it remains largely either aspirational or greenwashing. At the moment there is not convincing plans that we can reduce. that one estimate was done that global military emissions are about 5.5% of total emissions globally. That was just done recently in a report by Scientists for Global Responsibility, which is significant. That's like double that produced by civil aviation. And every time we increase military spending, because a lot of that goes towards operations, towards equipment. In fact, the NATO goal of 2% of GDP requires a certain amount to be based on increased equipment. Every bit of that new equipment tends to be increasing the emissions. And this is just at a time when we need to be doing the opposite of reducing emissions.
Well, Pieter, let's have a look at some of the numbers that have come out of your organisation, SIPRI itself. Sales of arms and military services by the 100 largest companies in the industry in 2021. If we take the 100 biggest companies, it's $592 billion US. There's been a 1.9% increase in real terms, and that's during a time in history when inflation is running pretty high around most of the world, especially the developed world. Is there no room within those budgets for trying to make the situation better, or is that a waste of time?
Well, as I said before, I mean, it's extremely important that states really thoroughly think through what they actually want to have. And I think one of the things which you can kind of highlight with the figures about the arms industry itself is that there is a significant turnover that in terms leads those industries to have a certain lobby strength, and therefore they will push for their weapons to be something which is important to acquire, especially at this point in time. And it is here really that the importance lies in trying to find ways to, let's say, change that narrative and be more conscious about the fact that maybe we're not just in a war in Europe, but actually we are at war with an environmental crisis. That you have to put it in these types of terms and then be able to compare the different goals that we have, and then to listen to the different industries and what they have to offer, but finally make the decisions about what is being acquired on a very thorough assessment of what is being needed. And again, that is so difficult to do at this point in time when it comes to military spending. What is it we really need? Do we really need to spend more on arms to defend Europe against Russia? Or maybe is an investment in more green energy also part of a security policy, as it would make Europe less dependent on fossil fuels from Russia and other potential, let's say, hostile states. So I think all these kind of different considerations need to be taken into account when comparing the different industries with each other and the benefits which you gain from investing in either an arms industry or a more greener, more sustainable energy industry.
Nick, I'm assuming that you would agree with that, but of course it's not just energy security, is it? I mean, you require food security, you require water security. There are plenty of other important areas that need to be bolstered and maintained in order to ensure that Europe protects itself.
Yeah, I think Pieter raises a really important point that being tied to an oil economy has also tied us to a war economy. I think there was an estimate at one point that a quarter of all wars were tied in some ways to oil. So if we move towards a more green economy, we are also moving towards a more peaceful economy, and also not bolstering autocratic regimes which have kind of concentrated power due to the concentration of oil wealth. So I think this is a really important point to make, is that a green economy moves us towards a more peaceful economy.
Will it not just cause the rows to be over rare earth metals rather than oil instead?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some potential for that. I think one of the things that climate change teaches us is that we can't tackle this issue behind national boundaries. It's a global problem. And that can actually be a way of kind of building global cooperation. And that's my hope, is that we can use this opportunity, because we have carbon knows no boundaries, because nationalistic or even military solutions, a tank cannot stop climate change. It points towards a different, more collaborative approach. And we even see that in small ways happening right now with a rising hostility between US and China. At the very least, it seems that at the last meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, that climate became one of the points of where they actually could collaborate and get together and form a common view. And my hope is very much that climate can kind of play that catalytic role towards more cooperation and collaboration to tackle some of the crises you mentioned, the climate crisis, the food security issues, and water securities. Because in the end, those are very much climate and ecological crises that ignore national boundaries and require a vision and a way of working which works across borders.
Nick Buxton, Pieter Wezeman, thank you very much for your time today. That's all we have time for, but remember you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and the entire team here, thank you for watching and goodbye.